Yes. Matthew 13. 13. 1-3, yep. Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. Everybody wants to go ahead and take their seats. I know Mason and Brittany are here, so everybody's talking to them right now. Good to see everybody here this morning. Well, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to continue there where Derek left us off on Wednesday night, talking about different parables that Jesus is teaching here in this chapter. So before we get into the text today, can somebody tell me why Jesus is teaching these parables? We talked about this on Wednesday night. Let's do a little review. Why is he teaching these parables? What's the point? Matthew tells you, yes, he does. So what's the reason? All right. Why is he teaching them in parables? Yep, they hear but they don't hear, and they see but they don't understand. Right? Yes, Rick. Yep. Yeah, exactly, right? And that's a very good point. And you even see it here is, what are all these parables about? They're about one specific thing, the what? The kingdom, right? All these parables are about the kingdom. And as we've seen in the previous chapters, like Rick said, he's been doing tons and tons of miracles on a daily basis. So people are following because who wouldn't want to see that, right? Wouldn't you want to see somebody get healed, somebody start walking that couldn't walk, somebody that was blind now seeing? That's an amazing thing to see. And so Jesus now is transitioning. Okay, I now have all these people's attention. Now let me tell them the truth. And the best way for me to do that, right, is through parables, things that they already know. And like Rick said, right, it's going to sift people. If you really, truly want to understand, you're going to come and seek that knowledge, right? And as we saw on Wednesday night, when Jesus told the parable of the sower, what's it say there in verse 10? Verse 10, after he tells the parable of the sower, tells this all, and then we don't get an explanation right away. What happens in verse 10? Yeah, the disciples come and say, okay, why are you speaking to them in this way? And then tell us the answer, right? Like, that was a great parable. Now, what does it really mean, right? If you truly want to know, you're going to ask. You're going to ask about the kingdom. Yes, Jen? Yep. Yeah. It's his way of teaching, right? And it's interesting is when he speaks to the Pharisees, does he talk to the Pharisees and scribes in parables? When they're the main audience? No, it's very direct, isn't it? Huh? They're not going to listen anyway, so let me just tell you. And then with the crowd, it's now let me tell you in a parable so everybody can understand what I'm talking about, but if you truly want to understand, you can see that. Okay. So we talked about that. We also talked about the couple parables. We talked about the parable of the sower or the soils. And I also talked about the wheat and the weeds. What was kind of the point Jesus was making with those two parables? It starts with what? What's the point there? What are the different soils? What are they supposed to represent? Different hearts, right? Again, here's the parable. Are you truly listening? And when you do receive it in your heart, how are you going to react to it? And then with the wheat and the weeds, what do we notice about that one? How did those grow up? Do they grow up separate or what? They grow up together, right? When the master goes out and he has his servant, he plants the seed, and then his enemy comes in, plants their own seeds, and what do the servants say? Didn't you plant good seeds? Why do we have weeds? Yep. They had enemy, yeah. And yeah, they've always had enemies, right? And so the point is, though, is right, Jesus isn't saying, well, let's get rid of the enemies and then they grow. No, he says, all right, we're just going to let them both grow together, the king does. And then he says, now we'll gather them and then separate them on judgment, okay? Any questions about those two parables before we get into some other ones?
Later on, he'll tell you the purpose of parables was to fulfill prophecy of Isaiah.
Yeah, in verse 34, yep.
To reveal things that were hidden from the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
So they've never heard anything like it.
No, different parables that they've never heard before. Yes, exactly. Okay, so we're going to jump now into verse 31. We're going to do kind of what these little quick hit parables, I guess you could say, right? When most people say, hey, tell me a parable of Jesus, people go to, oh, let me tell you about the soils. That's usually a big one. The Good Samaritan's another big one, right? And then you have kind of like these little one-verse parables that we're going to talk about today. Does that make them any less significant? No, you should still get something out of them, right? It's just, again, as Derek was talking about Wednesday, Jesus knows his audience. And he knows how he should speak to them, right? If you just heard, I don't know, a 45 minutes, do you really then want to hear another 45-minute sermon like 10 minutes after that? No, why? Where's your brain at usually after that? It's just mush, isn't it? So now Jesus is going to do these little parables of, okay, let me tell you a quick little point here. So the first one we're going to look at here is the parable of the mustard seed. If somebody could look at verses 31 and 32 and read those for us. All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Rick. Okay, the parable of the mustard seed. Again, what is he comparing it to? What does he say? Very beginning of this parable is what? The kingdom of heaven. Okay, so we know what he's talking about. He's saying the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Pretty sure everybody in this building by now, if you've been here for a couple years, has seen a mustard seed, right? If you've been through a VBS, right? All the kids come out of the back room with a little mustard seed in a jar usually, right? How big is that thing? It's tiny. I mean, if you put it in your hand, you'd probably lose it. What's the point Jesus is making here, though? Why would he compare it to the mustard seed, the kingdom of heaven? It starts out small, right? What kind of kingdom are the Jews looking for? What were they expecting the Messiah to do? Yeah, a massive kingdom, right? They expect their Messiah almost to be like David, right? He's going to come, you're going to know it. He's going to show up on the scene, he's going to kill a giant, he's going to behead him, then he's going to rout an army, he's going to kick out the Romans, he's going to do all these great things, and everybody's going to know who he is. How did Jesus come in to the kingdom? How? I heard somebody say something. In a manger, right? Did he come in looking at the Romans and saying, I'm going to behead you all, I'm going to get rid of you? No, right? Compared to what they were wanting, it was like a mustard seed, wasn't it? It was insignificant. Caesar's. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly, right? Again, it's that idea of what you're expecting is not really what Jesus is going to do, right? Like we talked about when Adam introduced us to this class, the little symbol there of the upside down crown, right? It's the exact opposite of what you're expecting. And so when he comes in, it's not some great, big, grandiose, I am the Messiah. It's, unless you're actually paying attention, you're not going to see it. But what does happen to a mustard seed when it grows? What's it become? A tree, right? Most mustard seed trees go anywhere between about 8 and 12 feet, right? But how big is this tree going to grow? Fulfill the whole earth, right? It becomes a tree so that what else can, it's bigger than what? He says there. It's taller than all the garden, right? It's taller than the garden plants. It's taller than anything else in the garden. And what can come and rest in its branches? Birds. Why would Jesus use birds? Yes, Rick. Yeah, very good point. Steve? Yeah, exactly, right? It's that idea of it's going to start here. It's small. It's going to grow so big that even those on the outside that really had no business in the tree can now be a part of the tree, can make their nest, their home in the tree, right? What's kind of interesting is there's a debate about what the birds represent among scholars, right? There's that point of it's the Gentiles. It's them coming in, because you're going to see here in a couple other parables where it's very clearly the Gentiles he's talking about as we go through our lesson today. And there's also the idea of, has Jesus used birds in a parable before in this chapter? Where else have we seen birds in one of his parables in chapter 13? They take away the seed, right? It's the idea, right, of the birds are there to try to get the seeds of the kingdom and take them away, right, as in the parable of the sower. Whatever one you go with, it can all make sense, right? I don't think really the point is the birds, honestly. I think the point is Jesus starting out, the kingdom is not going to start the way you think. It's going to be like a mustard seed, and it's going to grow bigger than anything else you can think of. Any other thoughts on this parable? Yes, Eric. Yep. We're able to support everything. Yes, exactly. It also, Jesus is actually directly quoting here Ezekiel 31, 5 and 6 as well, talking about a tree and birds and branches and things like that as well. Very good. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk about the parable of the leaven. Who wants to read one whole verse? Matthew 13, verse 33. Who wants to read that for us? All right. So we've gone from birds and seeds to baking, right? Just covering everybody here. When you hear leaven, what's the first thing that kind of pops in your head? You think Bible and leaven. What do you think of? I know what I think of. Huh? Evil, right? Sin, right? You look at Paul's letters, and Paul uses that as, right, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, right? How does Jesus use it, though? Is the leaven here evil? It's the kingdom of heaven, right? Again, just like the mustard seed. How many pounds of flour did your translation say there, Eric? 60 pounds, right? Some scriptures say 50. A whole lot of flour. Okay. Big biscuit. Yeah, if you're going to have a big biscuit. Yes, exactly. And I was actually thinking that when I was reading this, I was thinking, because Chanel will make bread at home, and I'm like, she doesn't use that much flour, but it'll make like a nice big loaf that can feed everybody. And I'm like, 50, 60 pounds of flour. How big a piece of bread could you make with that, right? But again, the point is, how much leaven do you actually use in bread, for those of you who are bakers? If you want to make a nice sized loaf, how much leaven do you use? Very little, right? Like, almost like a mustard seed's worth. A pinch, yeah, not much at all. And yet, what does that leaven do to that bread? To that flour, I should say. It's not bread. It spreads. It makes it grow, right? The flour itself doesn't contain the leaven. Once the leaven's in there, it's too late. And that's the point Jesus is making here, right? Is if you get that leaven in you, and what's the leaven, what's the flour represent here? And what is Jesus trying to talk about with the soils and things like that? It's what? Is he actually talking about baking? People, right? And their hearts. And he's saying if the kingdom can get into your heart, what can it do for you? Yes?
I think that there's an application here that a person can sow even the smallest seed, and you may not even know it.
Yep.
And later it comes to
Yeah, exactly, right? And I think that's a very good point, is you as a follower of Christ, if you didn't hear that right, is you can sow the tiniest seed, put in the littlest bit of leaven into somebody else's heart, into somebody else's life, and not even realize you've done it. And may not even see it actually grow, while you're around, but eventually it could spread in their life. That influence that we have, right? That idea of us being the image bearer for God. Being, as we like to say, the only Bible the world may ever see, right? That idea of being that good influence on somebody, of spreading that little bit, and then all of a sudden they grow, and you're like, I don't even know what I did, right? You could have just said hi to somebody one day, or asked them how they were doing, and that can mean a lot to somebody. And so, yes, we definitely do need to remember that. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts on this parable? Yes? Yeah. Or even yourself, yeah. How many times do we see or hear something that we should or shouldn't, and it just sticks with you? Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a very powerful lesson. Any other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Which is hypocrisy.
Yep.
And then through their teachings of doctrines.
Yeah. Very good point. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay, we're going to jump down a little bit because Derek covered verses 34 through 39 or through 43 for us on Wednesday night. So let's go ahead and jump down to verse 44 here. If somebody wants to read verse 44 for us, let's talk about the parable of the hidden treasure. All right, perfect. Okay. So what's the kingdom of heaven like here? Treasure, right? Oh, okay, now we're getting a little different, aren't we? Before it's been seeds and soil, it's been leaven, it's been a mustard seed, it's been wheat, it's been all these different things, but now it's something worth what? It's treasure, right? And it's hidden treasure. And we're going to get to that, so don't get ahead of me. We're going to get there real quick, yeah, right? It's treasure. Now it's something that holds weight, holds value, doesn't it? It's not something insignificant. It's buried in a field, so it's hidden, okay? What's the man doing? I find this interesting. What's he doing? He's not seeking yet. He is here in a minute. It says, which a man found. What does that kind of give the impression of? He's looking for it, right? It almost, to me, right, it seems like he's looking for something, and then he almost just finds it by accident, right? If you find something, right, it's like, which a man found, so it's almost like he's not even really looking for treasure. He's just looking for something. And then all of a sudden he realizes, oh, I found something important. And he hides it again, right? Yeah, and then he goes and he hides it. So what does it kind of indicate here, right? Think again like what Rick said about the tree and the birds. Okay, who did you say the birds represented, Rick? The Gentiles, right? This is to me, when I read this, it almost seems like he could be alluding to the Gentiles here in that this is someone who is looking for something, and then they find the treasure. Like, oh, wait, I found something that I wasn't really expecting. Now here it is. So then he goes and hides it again. Why do you think he hides it in this parable? What do you think that could mean? Later on, yeah, he's storing it up. Yes, very good point. Yeah, you see that he hides it. Does he hide it though and like forget about it, kind of like a squirrel does? You know, a squirrel will hide so many walnuts that like it can't even find half of them later. I don't know how scientists know this, but they do. They ask the squirrels, yeah, you know, they ask, how many did you hide? Okay, and when you came back, how many did you find? But he hides it, but why does he hide it though? He doesn't want to lose it. He finds it somewhere that he doesn't own yet, right? He finds it and all of a sudden goes, I need to get this land. I need to own this. Whatever this is, right? Whatever land he's on, he doesn't own it. So he hides it. He puts it back. He stores it away. And then he goes and does what? He goes and sells everything he has just to buy the land, right? When you look at this, if you look at this kind of two different ways, right? If you say he's a Gentile, right? Is he expecting a Messiah, a kingdom, or anything like that if you're a Gentile? Who should be looking for the kingdom? The Jews are the ones looking for the kingdom, right? If a Gentile stumbles upon it, he's going to go, whoa, wait a second, I found something here. Does the gospel at this point in time belong to the Gentiles? No, it doesn't. Right? Jesus even tells the apostles, when you go, you only go to these areas because that's who it belongs to. It belongs to the children of God. And then he finds it and all of a sudden goes, I need to get it. I need to do everything I can to find it. This kind of reminds me of who in Acts? Cornelius, right? Of course, Julie would know that answer. She knows Acts. But it is, right? It's Cornelius. What do you know about Cornelius in Acts? He's considered a what? A Gentile, but he's also considered a godly man, right? He's someone who's trying to find God, to seek God out. And finally, God sends a vision to him, an angel to him, and he tells him what? I got your answer, go find Peter. Right? That's who he's talking about here, is this person who just finds it, and then for whatever reason they hide it, right? They go, okay, I need to get whatever I can out of this. I need to hide it in my heart and then use it and use that treasure. Any thoughts on that? Yes, Mason. Exactly. Yeah, if you find a treasure, right, let's just say you find buried treasure somewhere. Are you going to know exactly what to do with it right away? Probably not, right? Unless you've been planning on finding buried treasure and you have it all planned out. You're going to probably freak out for a minute, aren't you? Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? You don't tell anybody because you don't want anybody else to know. And then you bury it, you hide it because you're just thinking, what do I do with this? Right? Yes, Scott. Yeah, exactly right. And I think you bring up a very good point. And for those of us who have, quote, grown up in the church, right, is you don't realize what you really have until someone, like you said, who's never heard it, sees it and goes, oh my goodness, you have this? Right? We need to realize how valuable the message that we've been given is. What Christ has given us really is to the world, right? Not just to ourselves. We need to realize that. But then that should cause us to what? Go tell other people. And like you said, I think sometimes we get so jaded by the world that we just go, right? Who's really going to want to hear it? But then when that one person does, they'll act just like this. They'll drop everything just to get a hold of it. Yes, very good point. Adam? Yeah. Yeah, very good point, right? And that's the whole point of Matthew, isn't it? Is here's Jesus, what are you going to do with him? Right? You have a choice you have to make. Right? Again, how long that's going to last, you can get into the soils and things like that, but it's that reaction of, and you even see it in Matthew, it's Jesus looks at Peter and John and says, what? Follow me. And then what's the next line? And they dropped everything and followed him. And you're like, why would they do that? Well, it's because they realized this is it. This is what we've been looking for. This is life. This is what it's all about. Nothing else really matters in the grand scheme of things. Exactly. Yes.
To that point, we would say today,
He's all in. Yep.
he's destitute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of what his
Yep.
treasure is.
Yeah.
And then think of the great act.
Yep.
Great faith, despised, and until the danger was gone.
And then she released him. Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is when you look at Rahab, who's mentioned, by the way, again in Matthew, right? It's she knew something about God, right? She even tells the spies, "We've heard everything, and I need that," right? So she hides them, and then what happens? If you weren't in her house, her other than what was in her house became what? Destroyed, gone. Right? And so all she had was whoever was in her house, and then this whole new family she became a part of, right? The nation of Israel. So much so that, yes, she ends up in the lineage of Jesus himself. Very good point. Any other thoughts? All right, let's go on to the next one then. Let's look at the pearl of great value. If somebody wants to read 2 verses this time, big reading now. If somebody wants to read 45 and 46. Yes. Oh, Mary, go ahead. Sorry. No, you're good. Get the hand up there. Right. Yeah. And that's the question, right? Is how often do we look at somebody and go, "You're doing what? Why would you do that?" Right? Instead of saying, "Yes, let's do it. In fact, how can I help you do that?" Right? Very good point. Just about the zeal and excitement we should have about God and about Jesus. And Satan's going to look at you and say, "What? That's hard." Right? Do you really want to put in the time? Do you really want to put in the work? Do you really want to do this? Right? And then we get discouraged and we go, that is going to be really hard, right? I'll just do this instead. Very good point. All right. Somebody wants to read 45 and 46 for us. Very good. All right. Now, what is this guy doing? He's a merchant of what? Of pearls, right? He's specifically looking for what kind of pearls? Fine pearls, right? So again, this is kind of a little difference here of the last one. I think a lot of times we look at these two and we go, "Oh, they're just the same, except one's a treasure and one's a pearl. What's the difference?" All right. The first guy is looking but not really sure what he's looking for, and then he finds it. The merchant, though, is specifically seeking something, right? He knows exactly what he's looking for. And what does he do when he finds it? Sold everything and bought it, right? Again, I think with these two parables, there's a reason why Jesus puts them together is, right? One is kind of the Gentiles, right? The ones who are looking but not really sure what they're looking for and they find it. And then you have the Jews, right? They know exactly what they're looking for. And what are they looking for? What are all the Jews looking for at this point in time in Matthew? The Messiah, the Christ, right? They all know what they're looking for. And then this merchant, though, he actually finds that pearl, right? He knows it when he sees it. He knows it. And then just like we've been talking about with the disciples and the apostles, when they found Jesus, what did they do? They literally dropped everything and just went and found it and followed him. In the middle school class, they've been talking about Matthew. They're a couple chapters behind us, and I got to teach, I think it was Matthew 8 to them a few weeks ago, where the part where Jesus, the different men come up to him, and one of the people says, "Jesus, let me go bury my father real quick." And what Jesus' response to it? Let the dead bury the dead, right? And you're like, wow, that's harsh. And then another man says, "Jesus, I want to follow you." And Jesus says, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head." And try to explain that to middle schoolers, by the way. That's kind of fun. But they're a smart class. They got it. And we look at it and we go, man, that's so harsh. But then here's Jesus telling parables of, if you find me, if you realize what I'm worth, you should be willing to sell everything and hold on to it if you need to, right? Give up your former life and then follow me. Right? Any thoughts on these two? Yes? Yeah, exactly right. And I think kind of going back to what Scott's point is once we have it for a while, it just becomes, we just kind of become numb to it, don't we? We don't like to admit that, but we do. And then we kind of go, well, is there more? Is there this? And then we start kind of looking around. And then we need to realize, no, I already have it. Kind of an anecdote to that is, when I moved from California to Arizona, one of my friends, really good friends, his dad, used to live in Central California. I don't know why he moved, or the Central Coast of California. If you've ever been there, Pismo Beach, Morro Bay, Monterey, that whole area, to me, that's gorgeous country. But he tells me, he goes, oh, you're in your 20s. He goes, I get it. You're wanting to move to Arizona because you're, looking for something better. He goes, I used to think that way too when he lived in the Central Coast. He goes, I used to think there was always something better out there. He goes, and now I've spent the last 60 years trying to get back there, right? And it's that idea of you don't realize what you have when you've been there for a while. And a lot of times we get that way as Christians. I've been a Christian for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But we should still have that same heart that these men had here of, I should still be willing to just give it all up if it means I get a hold on to Christ. Right, very good point. All right, yes. Yep. Turn around, yeah. Yep, exactly, right? It's giving up that former life for this. All right, somebody wants to read verses 47 through 54. It's the parable of the net. All right. Okay, the kingdom of heaven is like what? A large net, a drag net that's thrown into the sea. Does anybody know what a drag net does or what a really large net does? It just drags everything. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Nemo, right? If you have kids or grandkids, you got at the very end of the movie, there's a big old fishing boat with a huge net and catches all the sand or all the fish, right? And it just sucks up everything, right? Anything in there is not going to be able to fight it. Somehow the fish do because it's a cartoon, but that's besides the point, right? But in real life, it's this idea of it's just going to collect everything. And when it does, everything that gets pulled up, right, they then sit down and what do? The net gets pulled up on shore and what happens? What are the workers doing? They start sorting, right? So what's the net? Or what is the sea? What do you think the sea is? Usually two answers you get from this. What's the world, right? You either get two answers, the world or the church, right, is what people will say. Again, it's one of those parables you can look at it either way, right? But what's the point, though, that Jesus is kind of making here? Who gets pulled up into the kingdom, right? Again, the net is the kingdom. Who gets pulled up into this kingdom? All kinds of fish, right? Every kind of fish, it says, okay? Again, if you look at it, right, Jews and Gentiles, Jesus is saying this is about everybody, Jews and Gentiles. They all get dragged up into this net. What happens when they get sorted? What do you do when you sort? What are you sorting? What you want and what else? You're separating it, right? You're saying, okay, this fish is too small, toss it. This fish is sick, toss it. Oh, this is a good fish, throw it over here, right? You're figuring out what is good and what is not good, right? Because you want the good stuff. You don't want to just grab everything and say, yeah, let's just take it all to the market or let's take it all and eat it. And again, so think back to the parable of the soils, or the wheats and the tare, excuse me. What happened with those? How did those grow? They grew together. How did all the fish get pulled up? Together. But just like the wheat and tares, there's eventually going to become a what? How would you describe it? Here, Jesus calls it sorting. What would we call it? Judgment, right? There's going to be a judgment. Are you a wheat or are you a tare or a weed? Are you a good fish or are you a stinky bad fish? Right? All fish stink, by the way, but are you one you want to eat or one you don't want to eat? And what happens, and I think it's interesting here, though, Jesus comes right out and says who everybody is in here. He says they sat down and they gathered the good fish in the containers, but cast out the worthless ones. Who's doing the separating here according to Jesus? Huh? Not you, right? You don't get to decide who's the good fish and the bad fish. That's point number one. Who is in this parable? The angels and Jesus, all right? Jesus has the angels go out, and they separate the evil from the righteous. I think that's a very good point that Adam made there, right? It's not us, right? We don't get to take the net of the kingdom and go, you're a bad fish, so my net's going to be over here. Oh, you're a good fish, so I'll toss my net out to you, right? What's our job? Just chuck the net out, right? Again, think of the parable of the soils and the sower, right? What was the sower doing? Just sowing seed wherever he could, right? There's going to be a time for judgment, and it's not us who do the judging, right? It's the angels, it's God, it's Jesus. They're the ones who do the judging. And what happens to the bad fish? Or the bad stuff they pull up? They throw it away, and what does Jesus say? They get thrown to where? The fiery furnace, right, at the end of the age, will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Again, just like the wheat and the tares. Jesus' message isn't changing just because the parable changes. Right? Any other thoughts on this? Yeah, later it's sheep and goats. Yep, and they all do the separating again. Yes, Scott. Yep. Yeah, exactly right. We're not told here, right, what defines a good fish and a bad fish. It's just, you might want to be a good fish, right? What you do know, though, is God knows who they are. And then later, Jesus will tell them how you can become one, right? It's through Jesus. That's how you become a good fish. Very good point. Okay. Got a few minutes left here. So let's see if you understand, right? Jesus is telling all these parables, because we're going to kind of get in a little transition part here in Matthew. He tells all these parables, right? And the whole point is he who wants to hear can hear, and he who sees can understand. And so if you do understand, then there's a responsibility for that. So if somebody wants to read verses 51 and 52 for us. All right, perfect. Okay. Who's Jesus been talking to this whole time, by the way? Because if you notice in verse 51, he asked them, have you understood all these things? And it says, and they answered, yes. Who's the they? We need our context here. Who's the one who originally asked the question back in the beginning of 13? Who? The disciples, right? That's who he's talking to. He's not talking to the huge crowd. He's not talking to the Pharisees. He's talking to those who truly want to understand and follow him, his disciples. And he asks them, he says, do you understand all these things? That's a very good question, by the way, teachers, after you're done teaching a class, is do you understand what I said? Right? There's another little teaching chip Jesus is giving you. And they answer, yes. Great. Now you understand. Do you get to then just go, oh, I understood it, and go away? No. How does Jesus then compare them? He tells them again, another little parable here. How does he then compare them? Because every teacher of the law who's become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like what? What's he like? A master of a house, right? The master of the house, he gets to decide what? Who stays, who goes, and then he brings out of his storeroom, it says he brings out of his storeroom treasures. What kind of treasures? New and old. That's interesting, right? Why do you think he says treasures new and old? Yeah, Old Testament and New Testament, right? If you are a Jew listening to the disciples, listening to Jesus teach, should any of this be new to you? No, right? If you've truly been seeking what God wants you to do through the law, this shouldn't be new information to you, right? It shouldn't all of a sudden be like, oh, I never knew that, right? No, the whole law was about all these things. But if you're someone outside, if you're a Gentile, this is what kind of treasure to you. It's new. It's something you've never heard, something you've never seen, something you weren't expecting, right? And I think it's interesting here. He says, every teacher of the law who's become a what? A disciple. What's a disciple? A follower, right? Compare that to who Jesus has been arguing with these last few chapters. Who's he been arguing with? The scribes and the Pharisees. What did they consider themselves? What were they? They're not followers, right? You don't call one of them a follower, right? They're the leaders. They're the ones who, we tell you what to do, right? We know the law, so now let me just tell you what the law says and you do it. And Jesus is contrasting them here. He's saying, unlike them, if you are a true disciples, if you are willing to follow me and my Father, these are the things you need to do if you truly understand these parables. So now let's take all that, and I'm going to ask you a question here with 2 minutes to go. Do you understand what Jesus is saying here? What do you understand in your life then? Because people are nodding and saying yes, even though no one's actually saying it, because I don't want to say yes because they're going to ask me. Right? So what then do we understand, right? We can sit here and say, this is great for the disciples. I'm glad they learned these lessons because now look at all the stuff they've done. But what then can we take away from Jesus saying, you are now a store owner if you're a disciple of me, or a homeowner? What kind of things can we take away from that?
One of the main things to me is that when he says the kingdom is, then it is.
It is.
It exists.
Yep.
And it's like you believe in God. God is. And he's a rewarder of them that seek him. So it is like with the kingdom, all these characteristics.
Yeah, all these characteristics are
And people today
what they
will
are.
say the kingdom has not been established. Need to read these parables.
Yeah, right. He says the kingdom is this. Yes, very good point. Other things. What other things do you understand? Yes, Mason. Yeah, very good point. And I think that's kind of the big point here of all these parables, right? It's cast it out, right? It's not your job to decide. And in 2 parables here, we see Jesus even kind of explicitly says that. The angels are sent to separate, right? You're not sent to separate. I have my servants who can do that, right? I have my created beings. I got them. They have their own job. Your job is just to get it out there. Have the heart that is willing to accept it, and then have that heart then that is ready to spread it all out. Thank you all very much, and we'll pick up on Wednesday.